Happy 4th of July, everybody. I'm really glad to announce that for today's 4th of July episode, we're going to do 4 segments on the founding documents. 4 segments of instant classics, back to back to back, all on the important founding documents of this country. So get the kids around the computer. This is going to be the ultimate 4th of July civics lesson. I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is the 4th of July Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone, and patriots. I know it's a bad word these days, but we proudly own the word patriot. Welcome to the Dr. Duke Show, the only program that keeps you educated on the craziness impacting all the idiots trying to burn down this great country of ours, and those college campuses that abet that. Today, we're going to spend the entire show focused on the founding of our great nation, who, what, where, when, and how, events that took place nearly 250 years ago, which built the framework for this amazing experiment that is America. And to start, we're going to look at, and seriously, you're going to have to help me. We thought about bringing in a seatbelt to keep Katie in her chair, but whenever we talk John Adams, the girl can't help herself. And we're going to the first segment is going to be on John Adams' famous dissertation on canon and feudal law. Sounds kind of boring, but really critically important. And she's over there, she's jonesing. So take it away, Katie. She's jonesing. Yeah.
Jonesing.
Yeah, she's jonesing over there.
So really, you have to take a look at John Adams when we're talking about the founding of this country, because he is, I argue in my own thesis, the premier founding father. Even though at the time the Constitution itself was written, he was over in Europe, because guess what? He was serving the country that was to be.
There are many who argue that the singular most important figure in the entire founding of this country was not Jefferson, was not even Washington, it was John Adams. So a case can be made.
And I make that case because John is always behind them, pushing them forward, because very quickly, it was John who said George Washington should lead our troops. It was John who, as we'll see, said, yo, TJ, Thomas Jefferson, you should be the one to write the Declaration because they don't like me, and it's true.
And it was also Adams who, when those huge pressure on to get rid of Washington early on in the war, it was Adams who said no. Yep.
Okay, so we're going to take a look at the dissertation on canon and feudal law, and this is actually basically a 4-part letter series, I guess you could say, that John Adams wrote, and it was in response to the Stamp Act, which was passed in March of 1765, and this is when everyone's ears really perked up, and especially John Adams, because he saw what was happening, that the British were taking over the colonies more so than they ever had, and basically saying that we're going to tax the colonists without any consent, and now it also extends the British juridical authority into the colonial court system. And since John Adams was a lawyer, he was very aware of what is happening there, and he saw this encroaching power being taken away basically from the colonists. So he wrote these 4 pieces in the Boston Gazette. They were actually written as letters, and if you take a look at his diary, which I write extensively, he has kind of like his drafts in there. So these 4-part series basically tells you exactly how the canon law that existed and the feudal law that existed, how the two of them put together would be destruction and how your rights are taken away. So we're going to take a look at maybe a couple of the different, pieces that he wrote throughout these 4 letters, because we don't have time to talk about all of them. But I guess you talk about which one you enjoyed.
Well, the thing I wanted to just is comment, right, that when he was writing this and much of what he wrote, Adams was concerned about capturing the spirit of liberty.
Yes.
So I wanted to talk briefly of that. I'll let you do the more micro analysis. But spiritedness for Adams, the idea of the spirit of liberty, united in body and soul certain sensations of freedom and certain ideas of right. Adams sought to inspire the colonists' sensations of freedom by imploring all patriots everywhere to recall the hardships endured by the first settlers in order to guarantee these present freedoms. On a deeper level, the revolution for Adams was about ideas of right. So he appealed to the colonists' sense of reason. That's what's so great about this. When you think about revolution and revolt, like what's going on in our idiotic streets right now, you think of a lot of emotion and very little critical thinking. Adams was exactly the opposite. He founded a revolution based in reason and critical thinking, which is why it was such a relatively unbarbaric revolution compared to what happened in France a couple years later.
And if you take a look, and you would have to read all of this, the way Adams approached it, and the way all the founders basically, when they got together and discussed these things, not they got together and we're going to tear things down. They got together, the ones who actually formed this country, and thought deeply about it because they knew if they went one direction or the other, it could completely just fall apart.
You know, the funny thing about the American Revolution, perhaps unlike any other revolution in history, is how utterly anticlimactic the battles are. I mean, from one battle to another, you know, they lose, they win one. They kind of lose, they win one. And finally, it was really much more about the British Empire having bigger fish to fry and taking away with Napoleon, what was going on in France and other places. So it wasn't really, to be honest, a revolution that was won by overwhelming military power or even overwhelming military tactics. It was just to wait them out and see. More than that. What's so amazing about this revolution is how, as you said, philosophical it was. The biggest salvos, the great bombs and bullets that destroyed the British position was what these men did behind closed doors, and the biggest cannon of them all was Adams.
And it was basically diplomacy over everything. So even when you talk about thinking in the philosophical arguments to be made, in his fourth letter, he says, "We have been afraid to think." It made me think of today. We have been afraid to think. We have felt a reluctance to examining into the grounds of our privileges and the extent in which we have an indisputable right to demand them against all the power and authority on earth. And many who have not scrupled to examine for themselves have yet for certain prudent reasons been cautious and diffident of declaring the result of their inquiries.
That's great. And how about this one? My favorite one. How about Adams from the document on liberty? Liberty cannot be preserved without general knowledge among the people.
What?
Right.
Stop.
When you miseducate generations of kids, burning and looting everything, including the statues of abolitionists, maybe that's what happened in Madison, Wisconsin. Madison, Wisconsin yesterday, they want to tear down the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They want to tear down the Lincoln statue. And they're on record as having said, and I quote, "So what if he freed the slaves? Lincoln wasn't pro-black." Do you understand the consequences of that? That unless every historical figure wore a Black Lives Matter patch on their lapel, then they don't support black people and they gotta go.
And if they wore it on the wrong spot, that's probably
exactly
another reason.
Let me finish this quote. "Liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people who have a right from the frame of their nature to knowledge as their great creator, who does nothing in vain, has given them misunderstandings and a desire to know. But besides this, people have a right, an indisputable, an alien, indefeasible, divine right to that most dreaded and envied kind of knowledge. I mean, of the characters and conduct of their rulers," right? That we need that knowledge. And so that may apply to presidents and senators, but it applies to movement leaders like the ones in the streets orchestrating this anarchy. We should know all about them and weigh them by their Soros communist ties, not just presidents and senators.
And I actually triple scored that one because
You
that's
did.
also it. Because Adams, above all, was about education and having an educated and a moral populace. And we return to my favorite topic of all, John Adams. Now we're going to take a look at a couple letters that John actually wrote to his wife Abigail. And before I get to that, I need to point out, if you at home are looking for historical documents to read, but you want a little bit of a love story in there too, pick up My Dearest Friend. It's the letters of Abigail and John Adams. Now, they are a couple that people don't talk about. You talk about George and Martha Washington. You talk about how, well, Thomas Jefferson and Sally. But, you know, we don't talk about John and Abigail, who, for all intents and purposes, is one of the most, like, powerhouse, could have been the most powerhouse presidential couple ever. They wrote between all the time of their marriage until they were finally together, more than 1,100 letters. So in that time, you're able to see not only how a marriage works back in that time, how having a family works, but also trying to found a country and all of the turmoil that's happening. And for most of their marriage, up until he finally came home and he became vice president and then president, they spent a lot of their marriage apart because he was serving either in Continental Congress, he was over in Europe. So he actually wrote 2 letters to Abigail that we're going to take a look at. And this is when he's in Philadelphia, and they're dated July 3rd, 1776. And for anyone who knows, I guess, any history, it's kind of an important time period there. So the first letter we're going to take a look at, He begins the letter, it's John to Abigail, saying, here's the realities of what's happening. He's worried about his wife and the kids being inoculated because smallpox is happening. He talks a little bit about meeting friends and families. And then he says that, again, it's dated July 3rd. He says, yesterday, the greatest question was decided, whichever was debated in America, and a greater, perhaps, never was or will be decided among men. A resolution was passed without one dissenting colony that, quote, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and as such, they have and of right ought to have full power to make war, conclude peace, establish commerce, and do all the other acts and things which other states may rightfully do. End quote.
Sad how far we've wandered away from that, isn't it? I mean, how many of our current problems are this way? Can I say something? I'm going to say it again at the end of the show. What the Founding Fathers created. I'm sorry, Black Lives Matter. I'm sorry, you traitorous college professors. I'm sorry, you misguided public school teachers who get your information from Howard Zinn. The United States of America was created as the systemically opportunistic place. This is not systemic racism. The United States was founded and conceived in systematic opportunity. In fact, so powerful was the structure that these founding fathers put in place, it absolutely guaranteed that over 10 years or 100 years or 250 years, the movement was towards greater liberty, greater freedom, greater equality. That is systemic opportunity. It is not systemic racist. A systemically racist system would have blacks going ever backward. We wouldn't be liberating them. They wouldn't be presidents. They wouldn't be senators. They wouldn't be rich basketball players. We would go the other way. We would be moving them farther and farther back to slavery. This is a system of opportunity. It is not a system of oppression.
And before anyone says, I don't care, John Adams is white and we need to cancel him, he never owned slaves. Never owned slaves.
Yeah, but like the Abraham Lincoln. But was he pro-black?
Ah, that's a good point. Was he?
Did he raise the fist? Did he kneel at the? I know the anthem hadn't been written yet, and there was no
but did he kneel?
Real flag yet.
This is true.
But did he kneel? Did he kneel in advance of that?
I'll go back and check his diary entries. I'll have to double check on that. But in this specific letter to Abigail, he also says, just actually right after that you will see in a few days a declaration setting forth the causes which have impelled us to this mighty revolution and the reasons which will justify it in the sights of God and man. A plan of confederation will be taken up in a few days.
But they keep telling us, Howard Zinn types keep telling us that the Founding Fathers were Christians. They didn't believe in God.
Yeah.
Yeah. And look, the reason we are having the troubles we're having now is not because we listened to the Founding Fathers. It's because we stopped listening to the Founding Fathers.
Exactly. And this is the point where I'm going to point out to you, every July 2nd, I post basically the same phrase on the Facebook, celebrating what I see to be the Independence Day, because John Adams said that the greatest question was decided yesterday, and this is the 3rd. So you do the math. So it was actually on the 4th of July when they, read the Declaration, but we'll talk about that in the next segment. So the second letter I'd like to talk about, it's also dated on the 3rd. It's first John Adams kind of just reflecting. He actually puts into writing his reflection about, man, if we would have tried doing what we just did with this document and we're going to make this country, even if we tried this 6 months ago, how it probably would have failed. So you can take a look on your own, his reflections. But I want to say his statement, but the day is past. The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore.
And what do we have a Democratic Party to do? Donald Trump wants to go to to Mount Rushmore for the 4th of July, and the Democrats tweeted out that this was racial supremacy, white supremacy. Donald Trump wants to honor these Independence Day truths that John Adams so eloquently spoke of, and the Democrats tweet that this is stirring up the white supremacists in your organization. You got a war. The Revolutionary War, Mom and Dad, is being fought right now after 250 years. Are we going to be the party of Adams? Are we going to be the party of these feckless Democrat anti-Americans?
Now, we've kind of been teasing this the whole episode, but the Declaration of Independence is the next founding document. It's, I guess, the founding document, capital THNE. We're going to talk about the Declaration because, sadly, too many of Americans and our students have no idea what it is. Just a little background. A committee of 5 was put together back in June, again, 1776. In June, on actually June 11th, to be specific, a committee of 5 was put together saying, hey, guys, let's put this declaration. Let's make it. It consisted of John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, you know, the guy with the kite, Roger Sherman, who's from Connecticut, and then Robert Livingston of New York, but we kind of don't talk about those 2 guys because it's mainly the 3. And basically, it was John Adams who's like, yo, Thomas, you're young. I'm a little bit older and grouchy, and Ben Franklin, he's a little bit older and grouchy too. So let's have you write the first draft. So Thomas Jefferson goes off, and in 17 days comes up with the first draft, which would primarily, I mean, his first draft was a pretty darn good draft, and that would become the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, and you see these manifestos. Just look at the Obamacare healthcare legislation. Just look at every time a bill passes in Washington, thousands and thousands of pages that nobody ever reads. These are all kinds of giveaways and addendas, all sorts of compromises. The most serious questions of liberty and independence in this country were written down by people who used a paragraph.
Succinct.
A page or 2. Yep.
Succinct.
Be suspicious, my friends. The more Byzantine your declarations of war or peace or racial harmony, the more vocal and verbose become these pledges of racial riots. Be skeptical. The true parameters of liberty and justice don't require tomes. They require reflective paragraphs.
And that's why it begins. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And he could have just stopped there, but he listed that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Already, so much of everything that America
poetry.
is supposed to be is just.
And let me point this out to you. Back in the day that Jefferson wrote that, it has been estimated about 80, maybe 85% of the world's population was living under some form of slavery, right? Some form of slavery. So in other words, slavery was a universal reality, the experience of the vast majority of people alive, whether in Asia or Native America or China or Africa or South America. The reality for the vast majority of human beings at that time was slavery. So to go back 250 years later, and condemn America for slavery, there were fewer enslaved people in America than there were in the rest of the world.
Wait,
so,
can you say that again?
Yeah, there were
time?
fewer enslaved people in the Americas than
thank
almost
you.
anywhere else in the world. And I don't see you marching in the streets and capitals of Beijing. I don't see you marching in the slums of South America. I don't see you marching on Mexico City to protest these violence. You've racialized something that wasn't meant to be racial. Those opening lines of the Declaration, they absolutely guaranteed that within 5 years, 50 years, or 100 years, equality was inevitable for all. So rather than snarking about what they couldn't pull off 250 years ago, Jefferson wanted to write slavery out of the Constitution. How about appreciating with fireworks standing in front of Mount Rushmore? How about we appreciate what gave rise to the tremendous liberty we have in this country? That includes the liberty of idiot half-wit Antifa kids to stand out there and throw rocks and bricks and loot while American police forces stand down. It's a crazy system of white supremacy when rioting, looting, and assault is treated with nothing but quiet repose. That's a lot of things, including foolish, but it's not white supremacy.
And I know we don't like to read a lot. In the Declaration, it's not even that long. But just go read what we just read. Just the first couple lines, and you'll be better off than you were 10 minutes ago. actually not just time for some real education, because we've been having that this entire episode. But here is some time for some education that involves a painting. And it's a painting about the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, painted by the one, the only John Trumbull.
Yeah, and take a look at the broad image of this picture. This is iconic America. Yeah, and I get it. Are there any women there? No. Are there any African Americans there? No. Because you know what? Women in foreign countries, women in the nations of Africa and South America and Asia, they weren't there either. The idea that there were more enlightened places for women is a myth. The idea that brown and black-skinned peoples had access to greater levels of liberty than were being concocted in that painting, in that room, is also nonsense. So what you're seeing here is the construction of liberty and freedom, both for minorities and for women. And the fact that it wouldn't be realized fully, and maybe hasn't still be realized fully, doesn't matter. Because there was no place else in the world, perhaps in the history of the world, where the kind of constituencies progressives only want to advocate for had the kind of rights and responsibilities that they were being given them in that room, however long it took to mature.
And so John Trumbull actually did this painting. It wasn't done even in 1778. It was done, he was commissioned to do it in 1817, and then the painting itself got placed in the U.S. Capitol in 1826, which just so happened to also be the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And what's so interesting about this image is put in basically every elementary history book. I mean, it used to be. I don't know if it is anymore. But no one, unless you have a teacher who cares, I guess, about history, they just gloss over it. They don't even look and know what the significance of this is.
They see a bunch of white guys. That's
and
not
then they
something
move over.
They move over.
But to be fair, this is a representation. They never sat for this painting. Right. It's not like all the guys were there and then he painted it. John had to go and find likenesses of all of these characters, and it's not all of the 56 signers either. They only have 42 of them because already that's a lot of white guys in one room, for anyone to handle. But it just signifies you have the 5 guys who did the Declaration, and it's Thomas Jefferson in the front there handing over the Declaration, and you can see it in that up close shot. Just knowing the significance of them doing that and what it must have felt like, if you really look at it, you can try to capture that emotion.
You can. And again, go back to the founding words of the Declaration that are so aptly characterized in this image. What you've got is a system of white men, yes, privileged white men, educated Christian privileged white men, who were using their privilege to give birth to a nation that was indeed conceived in liberty and dedicated to that proposition, that because everyone is created equally in the name of God, in the image of God, that even those ways we are unable to create out of whole cloth, again, there was absolutely no precedent for this. A slaveless society, a slave-free society, a society of the kind of radical equity that you begin to see in the Republic as it evolves. There was no precedent for this. Even the Roman Republic had no precedent that they could go back to see. The idea that they were going to snap their fingers while they had a war to wage against the most powerful empire the world had yet seen, that they were dealing with all sorts of threats, foreign and domestic, that they were going to take time out to somehow carve systems of social justice is juvenile to believe. They gave you the system. It's up to us to implement it. It was not their responsibility to do what had never been done before. But they put in print the possibility. They made law the necessity that it get done.
And that's John Adams. All right, as always, you can follow us on Facebook and Parler. And if you have a question for our Friday Q&A, visit freedomproject.com/askduke or send us a message on social media. And as a reminder, Freedom Project Academy's live online school is enrolling new students for the upcoming school year. You only have 2 weeks left to enroll. So take a listen of a quick message from FPA's principal, Mr. Harper.
Hi, I'm Dave Harper, principal of Freedom Project Academy. Here at FPA, we have been engaging students in high-quality online instruction through a classical curriculum for 10 years. We use sophisticated interactive software designed for teaching online that is very user-friendly and fosters student participation in our live classes, not like Google Hangouts or Zoom meetings. Our outstanding instructors publish weekly assignment sheets, homework, and assessments in our learning management system that are easily accessible from a student's or parent's computer to any mobile device. We always encourage parents to be involved in their child's education and make everything available for them to see, including class instruction. We hope you'll consider joining us this fall and experience for yourself the phenomenal learning activities and engaging online environment our teachers create for students. For enrollment information, visit fpeusa.org. That's fpeusa.org.
Again, remember, enrollment ends in only 2 weeks from today, so make sure to request your free information packet at freedomforschool.com. That's freedom, F-O-R, school.com. And now, we're going to wrap things up with the funnest of all the fun facts in all the fun land. It's my favorite fact of all time. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. And of course, the debate, who died first, what was said. Apparently, they had their riders riding to each other to let them know that the other one lived. But supposedly, John Adams' last words were, "Jefferson lives," even though Jefferson had already died. John Adams at the time was 90 years old. Thomas Jefferson was 83 years old. And another fun fact that goes on top of it, 5 years later, James Monroe, the 5th president, at the age of 73 died. And if you take John Adams, 2nd president, Thomas Jefferson, 3rd president, 2 plus 3 equals 5. Monroe, 5th president.
Let me tell you a little story about a man named John Adams. Born in Massachusetts on October 30th, 1735, he would become one of the nation's first constitutional lawyers. Considered one of the most influential founding fathers, his first stint in politics was as a delegate in the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War. At 28, he married Abigail Smith and together raised 6 children, including John Quincy, who would become the nation's 6th president. Through his years, he helped draft the Declaration of Independence and wrote the Massachusetts State Constitution. John was the first to nominate George Washington as Commander-in-Chief during the Revolutionary War and John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In 1789, he ran alongside George Washington, becoming America's first vice president. 8 years later, he was elected as the nation's 2nd president. In 1800, he lost his re-election to Thomas Jefferson and became one of 4 presidents in history not to attend his successor's inauguration. John Adams died on July 4th, 1826, at the age of 90. Ironically, that day, Thomas Jefferson also passed, all while America celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And there you go, a little story about a man named John.
And I hope your minds are sufficiently blown. I'm going to take one last comment here because we're breaking all the rules on a 4th of July. Independence Day. Let us all vow to start calling it Independence Day again. 4th of July is just a calendar number. Makes it too easy for the opponents of liberty to want to erase it. Let's call it what it was. It was the day that independence for all was not just talked about, but it was enacted into law. And I want to comment again as my statement to you on this wonderful holiday of American independence, which was good for the whole world. What do I mean when I say that we are a systemically opportunistic country? Over the years, we set the structure up with these founding documents, these founding fathers, these founding principles, these dear documents. They set up and they set in motion a system of shocking, never before seen opportunity. Opportunity for slaves to become ex-slaves and free men. Opportunities for freed slaves to own their own slaves at some points, which happened. The opportunity for us as a country to move beyond the idea of slavery and beyond the idea of what a woman's role was and what kind of political activism and even the vote. That whole system was put in place. And if you, in your undereducated, politicized public school world, if you actually think it's happening too quick, fine, then try to accelerate it. But going back now and trying to erase that, you are erasing the idea, the systematic, structural idea of a country conceived in liberty and opportunity. You are not correcting the flaws of the past. You are trying to erase them. And if you get rid of that, you have gotten rid of a system of opportunity, and you will be the ones who have replaced it with a system of bias and prejudice. So you keep doing what you're doing out there, you anarchistic revolutionaries, but recognize you are not replacing a freedom project, literally a freedom project, with a freer one. You are taking a freedom project and you are making it unfree. Happy Independence Day, America.